Hashtag Black Lives Matter. But let's ask the provocative question, why do they matter? On the 25th of May, 2020, George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis by a cop who stood on his neck for 9.5 minutes. This sparked a conflagration of unrest which has spread not just across the United States of America, but even across the globe. And there is a tremendous pressure being put on all of us to respond in some way to support the Black Lives Matter movement, or perhaps to speak out against it and to challenge the idea that only Black Lives Matter, and to respond to the All Lives Matter counter movement. But I was once in Bethlehem, and in Bethlehem, Israel, in 2015, I had the honor of watching Ravi Zacharias give a presentation in which he was asked to come and to address the conflict between Israel and Palestine. He chose wisely not to answer the question, but rather to say that he could not speak to the systemic problem inside of Israel and Palestine, but that he must only answer in the things that he could answer, and that he would try and offer a solution. This will be my attempt to give you a response which really does not support one side or the other of this, but tries to seek out the real reason for what's going on and to address the only solution that there is that can bring this forward without destruction. Now, you may think it rather arrogant of some guy on the internet to try and address what is a huge and deep and very complicated issue. I do have some experience dealing with such things. I was in Israel and Palestine at that time because I was part of the United States Security Coordinator's mission for peace in the Middle East. I spent a year working in diplomatic relations with the Palestinian Authority, working on professionalizing their security forces to meet the international standards, and in order that Israel might recognize them and their right and readiness to govern themselves. This was in the midst of what was then being called the Third Intifada, which was a time of tremendous violence. I saw many acts of injustice on that occasion, and I certainly have also engaged in other, shall we say, diplomacy by other means over the course of my 20-year military career as an officer in the Infantry of Canada. Now, this might not seem very credible to you, and that's fine, but what I want to try and help you understand is that these kinds of issues, like the Black Lives Matter unrest, cannot simply be addressed by demanding justice. The idea that we would demand justice is nearly impossible to achieve. And that may sound harsh and it may sound ridiculous to you. I am not trying to suggest that there can be no justice in regards to the punishment of the police officer who killed Floyd George. Certainly there can be justice, there can be punishment. But is that really justice? And here is the thing that I want to ask you. What is accomplished when the person who killed Floyd George is himself punished? Well, there is a recognition of the tremendous violation that was committed by this man. There's a recognition that he took human life, that he did it out of an act of hatred and neglect of the value of another person's human life. But if you look at Floyd George's 6-year-old daughter, is that going to do anything to give her back the lifetime that she could have had with her father? Is it going to do anything to the reality that this man no longer can do anything good or bad to redeem himself or to contribute further to society? There is a fundamental way in which there truly cannot be a justice this side of the grave which can address and change the past wrongs. Fundamentally, when we are looking at major and complex societal issues like systemic racism, it's a huge issue in the United States of America. It has a long history. It doesn't come out of nowhere. But if you want to seek redress and justice for the racism that is derived from racial slavery and the abuses and the systemic issues that have plagued the blacks in the United States following emancipation, the poor startup, the inability as a large group to have any capital with which to establish themselves. Well, all of the white people did have capital to some extent in which they were able to establish themselves, and everything that has gone on from then, including continued acts of racism and segregation, and so on and so on and so on. There is a tremendous and deep pain which cannot be paid for. And I can't really address that because it's a very complex issue, and it is not a part of my personal experience any more than I can address the experience of an Indigenous person here in Canada who has been subjected to a tremendously difficult start state in their life because of the decisions and the abuses of past generations. Those are real injustices. Can we make them right? At best, we can stop adding to the injustice, but we cannot fix the things that have already happened. And this is fundamentally the problem when you look at an issue like this. So I can speak to the experience in Israel of a Palestinian, and I can speak to the experience in Israel of an Israeli, and I can talk at length about the real just anger that has been built up because of past injustices, past acts of crime, past terrible things that have been committed, and yet the way forward is what? What are you going to do in a situation where both sides are justified in being angry with the other side for things that have been done to them? What are you going to do in a situation where, and recognize that this history in Israel, we're talking like 80 years of injustice built up that has created this near intractable problem. And here in the United States and in Canada, we're talking about hundreds of years old issues. And we can't simply go back and list all of the things that happened and find a redress, because there's no functional way to do that. It simply would create an unlimited system whereby we go back and punish everybody for their great grandparents' failings and sins. And so what do you do about that? You have to look at the situation as it stands right now, and you have to try and see what the way forward is to create a different situation going forward. Now, we can always talk about, well, there should be monetary reparation. Neither for nor against that. That is a credible political decision to be made. If you want to look at the situation in the United States and say, well, based on the enslavement of your ancestors and based on the poor conditions in which you were introduced into free society, we feel that monetary compensation will try and reestablish a better balance in our state. You're welcome to try that. But is any amount of money going to make Floyd George's daughter have a father? Her own father? Is he going to come out of the grave because you give a bunch of money to her? The answer is, of course, no. You can't fix that. And if I could use an example from my experience in Israel and Palestine, an experience would be that there was a situation in which a young woman of about 16 years of age who was, shall we say, radicalized by Hamas or Hezbollah or some other organization, that in the midst of what was going on, she was convinced to sneak into a settlement, to sneak into the house of a settler, and to stab a baby to death in its crib, whereupon the house woke up and the father of that baby went in and shot her until she was no longer recognizable as a human being, right? And of course, now the family of this 16-year-old is without a daughter. And this man has killed their daughter when he could have just subdued her after having killed his baby. And they're terribly upset at everything that has happened. They're terribly upset that this could have transpired. But they say, well, she was justified. If you settlers weren't here, this wouldn't be a problem. And the settlers says, well, I had the legal right to be here according to my government, and now his child is dead. That's it. So both families have lost a child. What are you going to do to bring those children back? What are you going to do to erase that pain? This is the problem of sin, is that sin cannot be erased. When you say something, it remains said and nothing can unsay it. You may attempt to change your attitudes in the future dealings and it may be forgiven, but you can't unsay it. And when you commit acts of wrong against people, of oppression, of suppression, of dehumanization, of murder, those things remain done. You can't undo those things. They are there and they will always have been done. So how are you going to change that reality? The answer is you aren't. So you have to ask yourself the question, fundamentally, why do Black lives matter? Why is it possible that some people seem to think that they don't? Right? Because ultimately, this is what the rallying cry is we demand that you recognize that our lives are important and have intrinsic value, right? That is what they're asking for. They're not asking for us to recognize only that Black lives matter. They're asking that we recognize that Black lives also matter. But the real question is, how can any lives matter? Certainly, if we were to look at Stalin's perspective, individual lives had no value. That arguably is the only logical conclusion of a nihilistic materialist worldview, is that life does not intrinsically have any value. So where does that value come from? The value can only be received from some outside force. Otherwise, it's derived, right? And if it's derived and you say life has value because of its potential, well, then you only value that life that has potential to do the things that you think are good. So life itself is no longer intrinsically worthwhile, and genocide is fine, logically speaking. But the reason why Black lives matter is because these are the children of God. These are the sons and daughters who are made in the image of God. They have inherent value because God has made them valuable. They are intrinsically valuable, and God demands that we respect all human life. And if there is a segment of the population which is not having their life respected, then this is the person who, if you want to look at the parable of Jesus in which he describes the Good Samaritan, who is your neighbor? Well, the Samaritan was the man who saw the person bleeding in the ditch, and he dealt with that person. It wasn't his calling to go and to try and, comfort the priest who'd ignored the guy bleeding in the ditch. That was not what he needed to do right then. He needed to deal with the person in the ditch who was bleeding because they'd been abused and mistreated. And so when we respect that all people are made in the image of God, then those who are hurting, we ought to respond to. And we ought to be able to reach out and to try and help and stand beside them and to express our recognition of the value of them as human beings. Certainly that's true. But what I want to tell you is that nothing I do is going to bring George Floyd back. It's not going to happen, right? I can lay down in the street. I can write all kinds of things on the internet. I can say to everyone that I meet that I am terribly sorry for being a white man and being associated with all of the past wrongs. I deeply respect the lives of indigenous people and Black people, and I can try and express that even in the works that I do, and I can commit myself to trying to reach into communities that have less advantages and make sure that I can pass on my own advantages as best as possible to those disadvantaged. This is a thing I can do, and it still will not bring back a dead person. Do you understand that? It still will not change the reality of racial slavery. It will not change the consequences of racial slavery. It cannot. Nothing I do will change the present reality. It can only, perhaps, enlighten and encourage and lift up those who are going to be moving forward with me, at best. But there's something lacking. And what that something is this thing called forgiveness. And here is the real kicker, guys, is that the only way this ends, the only solution that is not death and destruction, that will bring satisfaction, is when the wounded party forgives the attacker. It is when the black community forgives me, and when the indigenous community forgives me, right? Whether or not I personally did anything against them, it is that built up resentment from past wrongs of our ancestors and so on and so forth. I can't undo that. It's impossible. I'm not saying we shouldn't endeavor to create a more just society at all. What I'm saying is those past wrongs need to be forgiven by those wronged by them. It is the only answer. And I will give you an example of two ways that we have examples of people who were wronged, who have responded in one without forgiveness and one demanding justice, and one who responded always in forgiveness. Now, there are an enormity of examples that I could give you of the first circumstance. Let's look at the French Revolution. The French people, the minority rich, ruled over them. The nobility and the royal class ruled over them and abused them tremendously. And then what happened is that communication began to get out that this is not okay and we need to do something about this. And people who had been deeply wounded by systemic abuse, classism, not racism, was the issue. And the poor were being starved to death in some cases and killed without consequence or repercussion. And in many ways, the experience was very much similar to that of a disadvantaged black community with far less opportunity to get out of the circumstances. And the answer was justice. We shall have justice. Now, if you know anything about the French Revolution, what followed is known as the Reign of Terror. And it wasn't just bad for the nobility, and it sure was, because they all, if they escaped to another country, they all died real bad. And it wasn't a good time. But then they turned on themselves because justice like that doesn't have an end to its appetite. There is always more justice to be found in the deaths of more people. And so their own leaders turned against one another and killed one another, and citizens were being ratted out for having the wrong sympathies, and they were killed. And that kind of justice ends in terror, the reign of terror. There is another response, and I will charge you to look at the early church. Now, Christianity, when it began to be a thing, was deeply despised, in part because of its association with the rebellious Judaic religion that it had spawned from. The Romans thought very lowly of the Jews because of the fact that they kept rebelling, and so they associated Christianity initially with that. But then Nero decided that he was going to put an end to Christianity, mainly just as a scapegoat, because they were convenient, because people generally disliked them anyway. And so it was easy to say that they're the problem, they're the enemies of humanity, and just he would like literally use them for torches. He would light arenas with burning Christians. He had them brought in and eaten by wild animals and lit on fire and massacred in gladiatorial games and all kinds of terrible things. And many of the leaders were crucified and so on and so forth. And that happened again after Nero died and that finished. It happened again under Domitian, and it happened again, and it happened again, and it happened again. And thousands upon thousands of Christians were killed over 300 years. And yet, they never responded demanding justice. They always responded with forgiveness. They always responded by being the bigger man and saying, this that you do to me is on you. It's not, I will not carry it. They responded to the Christian teaching that you are to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. They responded to the Judeo-Christian truth that you are to love your enemy, and if you see your enemy thirsty, that you will give him something to drink, and if you see him hungry, that you give him food, and in so doing you heap burning coals on their head. Because when you fail to respond with hatred towards hatred, then you necessarily make the one who is doing the act of injustice the bad guy to everybody's perspective. And also, it is because God says, vengeance is mine. You may not have it. It is mine and I will take it. What I want you to do is to forgive. And so forgiveness is the answer. But it can't be done by me. It can only be done by those who have legitimate grievance because of their circumstance. If the Palestinians could forgive the Israelis for all of the wrongs that had been done and truly revoke violence and reprisal after reprisal, then eventually this would pass. And if the Israelis could forgive the Palestinians for past wrongs, then it would utterly change the way that they dealt with one another. It is the only answer to that conflict. It is the only answer to black lives being abused in the States, is that the blacks who are being abused, that they forgive those who are attacking them and that they live righteously. This is hard, but it's the truth. And the only way that we can truly live this out is by the example of Jesus Christ, who went to his cross for others, that he died so that others might live. It is the only way. The Übermensch will to power is a straight line to the destruction of society. It absolutely will not end in any other way, but through the abuse of other people and through the destruction of the enemy. That is the only answer outside of Christ. You must have Christ and you must pursue the Christian example. If you can forgive, then you can defeat any evil, even as it kills you. And you have this, glorious image of Polycarp, one of the early Christian leaders. As he was led into the auditorium, he heard God, as did the other Christians there in the account, say, "Be the man." And so he went boldly and he faced the judge, and the judge threatened him with fire and said, "Regard your old age, Polycarp, and just pay homage to Caesar that we might let you go." And he said back, "Would I reject God who has loved me for the last 60-some years for the sake of a trivial, paltry life? No, send me on to glory." He said, "Do you not see, Polycarp, that I will send you to the beasts?" And he said, "Better that I die and go to glory." And he says, "Well, if you reject the fear of the beasts, if you're so casual about that, then I will give you to the fire." And Polycarp smiled at him and basically said, "Yes, you threaten me with fire that will burn for a time and be pain for a time. But what you do not understand is that you are threatened with fire that will last an eternity. Do what you will." And he spoke to the person who was going to kill him and warned him against the danger of his own soul. This thing that Polycarp did was the reason that Christianity ultimately defeated paganism, because forgiveness is infinitely more powerful than vengeance. It destroys enemies by turning them into friends. It destroys enemies by turning the enemy's friends against them for their viciousness. We need forgiveness. It is the only answer. Black lives do matter. And I pray sincerely that racism would end and that people would recognize the inherent worth of all men and women, regardless of their color, their background, or their culture. But I only see that this can happen in Christ and through forgiveness on all sides. That is my challenge to the Black Lives Matter. That is my response. I cannot take any other stand.